All right, I am Phil from AndroidCentral.com.
And I am Rene Ritchie from Tippy.com, and welcome to a Mobile Nations special edition podcast on the F word, fragmentation. And we have a special guest with us today. We have Michael DuGusta from theunderstatement.com. How you doing, Michael?
Great.
Thank you for joining us. Just as a little bit of history, you did an excellent article. Well, I guess it's debatable how excellent it was. It was a really well-researched article. That's why we're here today.
Yes,
and Phil did a rebuttal article, and the interwebs, as they are wont to do, went a little bit crazy. Can you just give us maybe a little bit of your background before we get started?
Sure. I went to Stanford and I worked at Apple back in the very early days of the web, and then left to do startup stuff. And during the first dot-com boom, eventually started and sold a little obscure insurance web software startup, and working on a new project now. And in the meantime, I'm sort of blogging at theunderstatement.com, sort of trying to focus on research and visualizing stuff, often related to tech, like in the case of the now somewhat infamous Android chart.
And so yeah, the Android chart. What made you decide to go there? What made the Android chart something of interest to you?
Well, I felt like there was always a lot of references out there sort of just in the ether about Android phones not getting updated, or not getting updated promptly at least. But I couldn't really find anywhere where somebody had sort of done the actual legwork of what phones came out, when did they get these updates, how out of date were they, and so I just sort of decided to take a crack at it and do it myself.
All right, and that brings me to my very good friend and Mobile Nations cohort, Phil Nickinson. You saw this chart, and did your brain explode?
Well, I mean, let's back up a little bit. This was probably, 3-4 weeks after Molly Wood from CNET had her, quote, Molly's rant on fragmentation and all this. And this is hardly the first chart like this we've seen. I forget if it was PC World or Computer Mag or Computer World, I think it was. Did one way back in January. And then I know of at least one Android site that did one similar as well. And they all share one thing in common, and that is I think they completely ignore the fact that comparing Apple's iPhone and iOS to Android like this is just ludicrous. It's ridiculous. And it makes for a really pretty chart and a really nice argument, but it's not a fair comparison.
But if you leave so leave the iPhone out of it then. Just ignore that part of the chart, and just take the Android chart for what it is. Doesn't that still say something about the state of the Android ecosystem and how it's being managed by Google and its partners?
Absolutely it does. And I think that's the important argument to have. It's not so much the comparison, but it's that, I mean, there's nobody out there who can say with a straight face that Android smartphones are being updated in a timely fashion. But I think the argument needs to be made that they don't all need to be. And that was something you did in your post. And again, you did a great job researching it, because I've looked into this. It's a huge pain in the ass to track down. Absolutely.
Well, I think that in and of itself is one aspect of showing the lack of a support ecosystem, that it is so hard to find what in most other spaces would be kind of basic support information.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And part of that is, I mean, Android just is not Apple. Android is not iOS. There's not just one building that you walk into and you get hardware, you get software, you get updates. It's spread out all over the world, figuratively and literally. But when you start compiling it all into a chart and saying, okay, here are iOS numbers and here are Android numbers, it doesn't work. And probably my bigger problem with this chart, and admittedly you said, hey, this is not finished. We've only gone through Q2 of 2010, right? Well, conveniently, that left out some of the stuff that would have changed the Apple lines from all green to yellow or orange or whatever the colors were. The original iPhone did not get an update to iPhone 4, right?
But it did get updates for 3 years after its release, which is what the chart was demonstrating, which I think is a reasonable time frame for. I mean, I don't think anybody would argue that more than 3 years is a reasonable support threshold for smartphones.
Oh, yeah, no, and 3 years is an eternity. I'd probably say 2 years is better.
Correct, exactly. And I thought that, I thought about even chopping it off at 2 years for exactly that reason, especially, contract links in the States and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, my real problem is when you consider putting all Android smartphones on a level playing field. And I don't think you can. and I've used a bunch of the phones that were on your list. Not every single one. Frankly, I don't want to use every single one. But when you start comparing something like the Samsung Moment 2 or the Motorola Devour to something like the Galaxy S1 or the Galaxy S2 and say that those phones deserve the same attention as these top shelf phones, I'm just not sure. I'm not sure you should.
I think that brings up two interesting issues to discuss. One is that what is a top shelf phone, and how are average consumers walking into a store supposed to have any idea when none of the cues, price, advertising, reviews, are necessarily good predictors of what is going to get support and what is going to get updated. And even us geeks sort of only know in retrospect sometimes. I mean, if you go back and look at the Android Central reviews of the HTC Hero and some of these phones that we now know are kind of dogs, or we think of as dogs, right? At the time, you didn't necessarily even know that. Right?
Yeah,
and phones like the Galaxy S, right? I mean, none of the Galaxy S phones until last week in the States, none of the Galaxy S phones have ever gotten an update, have ever run a current version of Android, despite that being cited as an example of the kind of phone that should get attention and support.
Okay, well, here's the question then. Do they have to? And this is the question I posed in response to Molly Wood was, well, do you absolutely have to have that update? Does the phone have to have that update? And the question is, does the phone have to have it? Do you have to have it? Does it render the phone useless?
There's two separate questions, I think. One is, from a consumer perspective, what does it mean to not get an update? Right? Mm-hmm. And then the other question is, from a ecosystem and Google and its partners' perspective, what does it mean to not have the infrastructure in place to support these phones at all? Right? No one walks into Best Buy or wherever else, picks up a HP laptop and comes home and finds out, I'm sorry, you bought the wrong model HP laptop. You're never going to get an update ever. You don't deserve an update because you bought the N7805 and you should have known to get the N7810. Right? The infrastructure is in place there in Windows land with its partners, despite the fact that there's crapware on the PCs and whatever else. There's still an infrastructure in place to support all of those devices. So I think that's an aspect too, separate from, hey, what does it mean to consumer to not get these updates?
Can I ask you guys this? If we go back in time, I remember when I had my Palm, getting an update was a torturous, unexpected, carrier-driven, colossal fail after colossal fail process. But then Apple came out with the iPhone, and they started pushing out these updates at a very quick pace, and they made them free. And I think because the iPhone was so popular and Apple kept doing that, it created an expectation in the market that you would be getting free updates for a certain period. Now, no one else, no Google, no Microsoft, no Palm signed up for that deal, but I think because Apple was so popular, that became the new normal in a lot of consumers' minds.
And I think it'd be fine if they said, it'd be interesting. I mean, no one's even tried to charge for an update saying, hey, if you want gingerbread on your Galaxy S,
iPod Touch in the early days.
Yeah, which they claimed was an accounting issue with some truth. But it's not. It's hard to say that it's expectation of free updates that's caused a lack of any availability of updates for so many of these Android phones.
So I guess the next question is, who do we blame? And I absolutely agree that I think you can take this back around to Google. At some point, Google has to do something. They announced the Android, the Android Update Alliance, at I/O last year, back in May, and we haven't heard anything since. So I don't.
Correct, which I think is a perfect example of how little they seem to actually be on this issue and care. Like the notion of 6 months ago, making this vague announcement about 18 months of updates with no explanation of what does that even mean, right? If you get update to Froyo 18 months after you get your phone, does that qualify? I mean, and then 6 months of radio silence. I mean, it's not exactly a confidence-inspiring rollout of we're taking charge, we're going to make sure that this problem's fixed.
Hang on one second, Rene. I mean, that's absolutely right, but the problem is the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We don't know that they're not doing anything.
I think it is. I'm sorry. I think it is. I think one of their concerns, the reason they felt the need to make this announcement, was a perception out there, certainly in the geekosphere, that this was a problem. That otherwise, why make the announcement at all, right? If it's, they clearly wanted people to know that they were doing something about this, at least they did for one day in May. And now I think that you can take silence as a demonstration that they're at least haven't finalized any actual regime for doing this.
No, I guarantee you it's got to be the biggest shitstorm you've ever seen in your life, trying to get the carriers and the manufacturers.
Well, let me ask you this, Phil, because that's exactly on point, and I don't want to be too Oliver Stone about this, but if we follow the money, Apple puts out one phone a year, and they do a series of updates, and then the next year they put out the next big phone with the next big firmware. Android, you review more phones by lunch than most people will have in a lifetime. And what's the incentive for updates there? Because the carrier, they're getting 12 new handsets next month. They want to sell the new ones, not the old ones. HTC's not getting money for making a new skin. Google's not getting any more. They don't get charged licensing fees to begin with. Who's actually incentivized to do these updates?
Well, I tell you who is the hackers, and I don't like calling. And I don't like calling them hackers. They're developers. That's who really gets incentivized to do it. That kind of comes back to what I really got to, and it kind of dawned on me looking at Michael's chart. We're not necessarily dealing with fragmentation, and yes, we're dealing with fragmentation. But I think in this case, we're talking more about dilution. There are just too many damn phones for these carriers and manufacturers to treat equally. Literally, you cannot do it.
I don't know. I mean, I think certainly my initial reaction to reading your piece is, those are somewhat synonyms. And in general, I think that there's sort of this looking at the Android ecosystem as it is and trying to come up with a rational reason and a sort of instinctive defense of why that makes sense. No other product, you don't buy cars and have people say, well, we don't care if they're supported or not, or computers or anything else. It's only here that people seem to think that companies are incented to not provide you the best experience possible. Doesn't Google want people using the latest version of Android so that when they walk into the store next time and they say, well, I'm not getting Android because Android sucks, not knowing that they've been running Donut and that's no longer
I love the car metaphor for smartphones, but at the same time, it's not quite correct because cars are not designed. The car that you buy in the showroom is not designed to be automatically updated to the next engine by GM or by Mercedes or whoever the next year around when the next car comes out. It's just absolutely not designed to do that.
But there's an infrastructure in place to provide parts and support and recall, and they want you when you buy the phone. They're out there saying, "Hey, you've got this warranty for this period of time." And don't you find it interesting that not a single manufacturer has stepped up and said, hey, especially if you're a second tier, you're LG or somebody, step up and say, hey, buy an LG. We do timely updates. Look at our track record now and going forward.
And the funny thing you're seeing now is Sony Ericsson came out today and reconfirmed that all of its 2011 Xperia line is going to get ice cream sandwich. Sony Ericsson used to be the laughing stock. Well, yeah. Sony Ericsson used to be the laughing stock of updates when you had the Xperia X10 that launched with 2 versions behind that phone launched with 2 years ago.
1.3.
Although in the States the next Xperia to launch was the first gingerbread phone to launch in the States after the Nexus S 6 months later.
Go figure.
So can we
6 months after gingerbread
can we make a line in the sand and say, like, for example, Apple doesn't update iOS 4 wouldn't go on the original iPhone. iOS 5, they strip off devices, and there's been some debate about legacy versus fragmentation, where legacy is devices no longer being sold, not getting updates, where fragmentation are current devices being sold, still not getting updates, or having something about their update making them not compatible with other versions of the same phone.
Yeah, there's a famous Andy Rubin video clip that went around
that I shot.
Exactly, saying it's legacy, not fragmentation. And I don't think that any reasonable legacy is buying something now and having it over time lose its support and get out of date. If you buy something today that's already out of date and it's never going to get updated, that's just getting screwed. That's not legacy.
Is that not a bad purchase? Is none of that on the? Some of that has to be on the consumer, and I'm not saying it's right, but some of that has to be on the consumer. If I go out and buy a 1985 Volvo today, I know it's not going to be. But the thing is, you're not buying a 1985 Volvo. You're walking in the store, you're buying a $200 Android phone that's gotten good reviews and is advertised on television with, like I said, launched during the Super Bowl, $230, whatever it is, right? And I think one of the things that, to me, this project taught me is we tend to see the world through sort of geek-colored glasses, right? That we know and we think about the Droid Razr and the Galaxy Nexus, and that's how we sort of
see things. But no reasonable person can or should be expected to sort all that out, right? That's Google and its partners and the people selling these products and supporting these products' responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the person walking the store and going, oh, by the way, you bought a brand new Honda Accord. You should know that doesn't really work. That car really doesn't work. I mean,
it won't work in Mexico. If you drive across the border, that car stops functioning.
Exactly. Or you can't, run Skype on that phone,
Phil, Jerry did an article for Android Central where he was trying to explain where legacy or fragmentation affects the end user. And one of the things he described was security updates. If there is a flaw found, if you have a phone that's older or that has a heavy skin like Sense UI, the period of time it takes for you to get your update, if you get your update, could affect you from a security point of view.
Here's the interesting thing about that. And HTC and Sprint, and I think it's them together, have done a really interesting job with some of their latest phones. So they can actually update independently. You can update the Sense side of the framework separately from the Android side. Really nicely done. And we saw that, I think it was the first week of the Evo 3D. We already had updates for apps that there were little tiny bugs in. So it's nice to see. Older phones, it can be an issue. I mean, to be honest, I just don't have on the top of my head, all right, here's the security issue, has or has it not been fixed? It doesn't necessarily have to be fixed an entire major version upgrade. So yeah, no, security is a thing, but they're always working on that. And I tell you what, I mean, if there's a security problem that needs to be fixed, they'll fix it. We've seen Sprint and HTC do that, and the other carriers as well.
Okay.
But it was eventually security that got Microsoft to sort of change its approach and set up an infrastructure of support and of rolling out updates and everything else. And in the same way, like we talked about with Sense, Microsoft's also provided its OEMs in the computer space talking with the tools to customize the OS. So when you launch Internet Explorer and on your Dell, it says provided by Dell in the title bar of every page. Not saying it's a good thing, of course, but at least there was an infrastructure for doing that. And similarly, on the Linux side of things, there's an infrastructure just in the way the operating system is crafted to be able to update pretty much every component independently over time that doesn't require this, you have to redo Sense for gingerbread and then redo it for ice cream sandwich. And Google seems to have not gotten on that bandwagon yet. And it might be security that eventually forces them to
security because it gets publicity, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd still wonder how much of that was kind of a reaction to Microsoft shutting down Windows Mobile and going Windows Phone route and locking down that platform. And I think Microsoft did a great thing by locking down that platform and saying, here are the things you can do to it, here are the things you can change. If you've ever used an HTC Windows 7 phone, you don't see Sense. There's a little Sense hub that's pretty much worthless. But it's not like what you see on Android at all. So when Windows Mobile shut down, I think the carriers and Verizon especially, because they're the big one here, saw this as their opportunity to replace that and say, all right, here's where we can do things the way we want to do them. You've really seen Sprint do it with the Sprint ID pack, which is kind of a middleman, right? It's not quite an entire skin, but it's a little more than a theme, maybe. I'll have to think about it.
It's a layer of cells.
Yeah, kind of. But it's certainly not as heavy as something like MotoBlur. And even then, Motorola has really backed off the Blur framework, I think, and realized that. And I tell you, I actually like a lot of the customizations they've done in the new UI there. And I kind of hate calling them skins, too. No, I absolutely agree. At some point, it became too much, and I'm not sure whether it was the carriers and the manufacturers. I think they're all to blame, and probably equally, and Google as much so for not saying, hey, yeah, and Google should have been like, guys, whoa, hey, we know you can do whatever you want with this, but maybe you shouldn't.
Well, and they have the hammer to do that with the Google Compatibility Suite and the access to marketing services. One of the questions I have for you, Phil, when you said that there's dilution and there's too many devices out there, is what causes that to stop? Right? You expect Samsung or Verizon to wake up one day and say, hey, we don't really need 18 only slightly differentiated slab touchscreen phones.
Jesus, I tell you, Verizon has shown no sign of that, have they?
Yeah, so I mean, if dilution's a problem, what fixes that problem, and whose responsibility is it to fix that problem?
And that's the really good question. I don't know whose responsibility.
I mean, isn't it ultimately
or is there one?
Isn't it ultimately like whether it's fragmentation, dilution, lack of support? These all sort of overlapping circles of similar issues.
Here's the thing where I see it though. Problem? Is the issue with the reason that Android became really popular is that Google gave the carriers a lot of incentive to roll out a ton of Android phones. And part of that incentive was that the carriers got back the kind of control that Apple didn't provide and that Microsoft is kind of in the middle of providing. And one of the things with that is the carriers can then choose, they can choose to put bloatware on the phone if they want to. They can choose to do all sorts of things, but they can also choose to invest in a long-term device strategy like Apple does, where there's one device a year, or they can choose to always put out a new device. So anyone coming into the store, if they want the latest device, there's always a new Android hitting, and that is the benefit of the carrier, to have that sort of crack-centric, very fresh, very in-your-face. Here's a new Droid Bionic. Here's a new Droid. Every month a new Droid. It really benefits the current strategy they have for getting customers.
Yeah, and I really am disappointed in the way we've seen the Galaxy Nexus non-launch so far, because and we talked about this on the Android Central podcast last week. It really looks like what was supposed to be I hate to call it an open launch, but just an all-encompassing launch. Think back to the original Nexus 1, where, hey, here's this phone, you can go buy it today, right? It's become just another launch.
The carriers punished Google for severely.
Yeah, exactly. And the politics of this thing are just becoming insane. And I really do envy Apple and Apple's power, and they did it right. And I wish Android would have a little more of that vertical line. It's not going to. At least it's not going to that extent.
So if Apple did it right, then why is my chart and what it shows so misleading and unfair and wrong? I mean, I think that.
Well, but Apple didn't make the chart. Apple's updating its phones in a vertical manner. I still think the chart is putting the Motorola Devour on equal footing with the Samsung Galaxy S, and that's just not the way it should be. Those phones do not deserve the same attention, for better or for worse. Is that fair to the consumer?
Because the Samsung Galaxy S costs $50 more.
I don't look at price. See, I mean, price is not an indication of the phone's worth. Price is an indication of what the carrier wanted to take a hit on.
If Phil would buy the phone, then it's worthy of support. If Phil wouldn't buy the phone, then let it rot.
Where's my Thunderbolt? Oh, it's uncharged because, you know what, we blew money on that. No. And I think anyone is going to take that stance, actually. You would be surprised how many emails I get saying, hey, this phone, you guys don't support it enough, but it's the phone I have.
This one is
absolutely
what are the criteria for what phone deserves support? If it's not price, what other criteria? How do you decide what phones deserve support?
I don't think I decided, but I think when you're
saying
Verizon,
Devour definitely doesn't, Galaxy S definitely does. So how do you make that?
I think Verizon sold a lot more. Which ones was that? the Fascinate. I think Verizon sold a lot more Fascinates than it did Devours.
Which didn't update either.
What's that?
Which doesn't run Gingerbread either. It's never run a current version of Android.
Is it the big brand ones that get the attention? For example, if it's part of the Droid line or it's part of the Galaxy line, those are the ones that they consider tier 1 devices. And if it's got sort of a unique name and it's not part of a line, those are sort of mid-tier. And then the weird little ones at the bottom are the new those are being reestablished as feature phones.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obvious, right? I mean, it's the same as.
I think there's some truth to that, but I don't think that explains all the data, right? It said Galaxy S, much beloved and hyped and whatever else, doesn't have a good history of support. There's certainly the Droid Aris, Droid Incredible. I mean, even the Droid X has been problematic.
Mm-hmm.
So is there too many? Is this just so? The thing with Android, though, is that you get a lot of flexibility, you get a lot of choice, you get a lot of carriers, a lot of hardware, a lot of form factors, a lot of versions, a lot of skins, and nothing in this world is free. Everything comes with a price, and the price you pay for being able to get a phone, not that Apple decides, but that you like out of 300 phones, is that you have to put up with the end result of that, which is this fragmentation or the lack of timely updates, because you can't have everything, right? Everything there's an opportunity cost to everything.
I remember standing at an AT&T event, I think, and I was talking with some ACC reps. And I think we were talking about the Thunderbolt, actually, which obviously isn't an AT&T phone. But asking them about an update we were waiting on to fix a bunch of stuff. And they were really getting into a maintenance release update, which is what Android gets when you're waiting on a big upgrade. But there are a bunch of things. It's like it.
0.1.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a Windows update, right? They do the Tuesday updates once a month, and it's sort of the same sort of thing. And they basically said for the engineers, it's a nightmare because every maintenance release is basically like starting from scratch. And there's a lot of that engineering.
Isn't that a flaw in the design of the operating system and its ecosystem?
I don't know. And that's the thing. I don't know enough about how that's done. I don't know when they're coding something like that. Do they really have to start from scratch? Are they starting from scratch
but
to try to get rid of those
bugs? Feel that way, isn't that Android, Google? Isn't that part of their job? Or at least you can hold them accountable for the result of the way they've done things. That even a minor security update is a major effort, especially when you're designing an ecosystem that's intended to have hundreds of phones. You think it would be an important feature of the design of that ecosystem that, hey, if we need to do a small update, because we're going to have a wide and diverse ecosystem, we need to design this in a way that is not a major undertaking to do a small 0.01 release for one device on one carrier.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, that's something that's something that we've seen HTC and Sprint do, right? We've seen them make it so that they can update separately. And I'm not sure if that's something entirely on HTC's end or entirely on Sprint's. Actually, it's not, because I've talked to them. It's a concerted effort there. No, it absolutely needs to be fixed so that it shouldn't take that long. And because ultimately, I assume it will save everybody involved money, because that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah. And are we seeing, I guess my question is we don't seem to have seen much evidence from Google yet that they're making big changes. That wasn't part of the hour-long ICS presentation. And why not? Do they why don't they use the compatibility suite why don't they use some of their engineering effort to work on this? Is it because they're fine with how things are? And if so, why the Update Alliance? It's kind of interesting trying to discern Google's motives and desires.
You can't. All you can see is the ripples around them, Michael. You can't look at them directly. But I think that's the thing with Google, right? Google's history and what we love and hate about Google is that they are incredibly fast to market. They create something, they put it out in beta, they fix it as they go on. The more people complain, the more they address it. And this is their constant strategy. It's what lets them get products in the market very quickly. Oftentimes products that don't exist a year later at times.
But notice one key thing about almost all those products is their websites, server-based, unified websites, where if they, ship it first, think about it later, design it later, at least all still in their control. Whereas
and we've seen that shift a little bit on the application side, where they took a lot of the core Google apps out of the ROM and threw them into the market where they should be. And in fact, we've seen them leave the Google market and the Android market and enter things like GitJar.
Even Apple's doing that now with some of their apps in the App Store.
Yeah.
But it's interesting also because with Android, Google, Android is, we've always said this from the beginning, Phil, Android is not a very Google-like product. Google probably would have made something like WebOS or like Google Chrome OS if they'd had more time to do it. Mm-hmm. And also scaling is hard. When you originally introduce like the G1 or the Hero or the Dream, I forget what the original one was called. That's a very easy thing to maintain. But when you start getting to 300 phones, 1,000 phones, it's like growing your little internet business to 1 million users and 10 million users. All the problems that you didn't even anticipate start to come back and bite you.
But I think what we see in the chart is that it broke down almost immediately, right? So the G1 Dream, right, was fine. Then almost immediately it was out of their control and not getting updated. And that they seemingly haven't learned from that or tried to put the toothpaste back in the tube. And it really makes me question Google's management when, yesterday, Matias Duarte came out and admitted again that Honeycomb was just a rushed... We had to get something out there for tablets immediately.
Oh, yeah. We didn't need Matias to tell us that.
Is this a well-managed ecosystem? We make an announcement about the Update Alliance and then do nothing. It just doesn't seem like Google is being a very good steward of the Android ecosystem and managing its partners well, or at all. It just seems like, hey, here's Honeycomb, here's Face Unlock, have fun, people.
But how much do you want? Because the whole thing, the way Android, and I'm not going to open up the open versus openy debate again, but how much do you really want Google to control? Android, whether you love it or don't like it, it is a polar opposite almost of Apple. And some people really dislike Apple's model. Some people want Apple out of their phone. And Android is as oppositional to Apple as you can be. Yes, they both have app ecosystems. Yes, they both have fancy phones. But the philosophy behind them is really different. And if you are going to get, you get Apple, you're putting up with control. You know that going in. You can complain about the control, but you bought that phone. Even if you didn't know about it, you're being controlled by Apple. And Android, you bought an Android phone, you are getting all the benefits and all the adversity that come with it being an open alliance where And that's something I want to talk to you about too, Phil, is a difference between fragmentation and a fork, because we spoke about a year ago about whether Verizon would just fork Android and get Google out of their hair completely. And now we've seen Amazon and Barnes & Noble's fork Android, and what control, if any, Google could have over forked devices going forward, because people will still complain, but Google will be absolutely powerless to do anything at that point.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen Amazon and you've seen Barnes & Noble, fork Android and do what it was designed to do. Take the code, make your own thing, and take it entirely out of the ecosystem. You don't hear people complaining that, hey, my Barnes & Noble Nook isn't on, it's not going to get ice cream sandwich, and it's probably not, right?
Damn it, Phil, I want my ice cream sandwich.
I was at the Nook tablet launch, and one of the execs accidentally said that the Nook tablet has honeycomb. And he said, "Oh wait, no, sorry, it didn't have honeycomb." Because everyone's like, "What?"
Everyone reported it. I saw that coming out of the reports too.
Yeah, wow, people type fast because he walked that back really quick. Yeah, so at the same time, you don't get the same complaints. I mean, here's my big thing, and it goes back to what I wrote in response to Molly. Half the phones I've used, as my daily drivers for the past several months have not been Gingerbread phones. They've been Froyo phones. And for what I do, which involves a lot of email and traveling, it's been just fine, right? I mean, the browser works. It does email. Does that mean I'm putting up with it? Maybe. I don't know. But at the same time, it's not, I'm not living my day saying, this thing needs Gingerbread or it just sucks.
Well, Georgia hasn't updated to iOS 5 yet. She's still on iOS 4 point something because she wants an untethered jailbreak, and that to her is more important than running the latest firmware with all the features that it provides.
Now, the difference there is she has the option to.
Yes, that is true.
I think the other thing that the chart sort of indicated to me is just that, which is there are sort of, two Androids out there. One is the sort of geek-centric, hey, I want my ice cream sandwich. But a lot is what you referred to, sort of the new feature phone. It's just people buying essentially dumb phones with Facebook and Angry Birds. I mean, that's how they see them. That's how they use them. Mm-hmm. And they don't know, just like no one ever knew if their Nokia Candy Bar phone was running the current Nokia OS. I mean, no one knew, no one cared. And I think there's a lot of evidence that that is a large part of the Android ecosystem too, which is perfectly fine, but it is different than, hey, all these people are buying these phones just like people are buying iPhones or just like people are buying Nexus S's or whatever else. It is different people are using Android that way.
That's a good point, too, Phil. Like, my mom has no idea what version of iOS her iPad or iPhone is running. My sister doesn't know. I mean, my sister updated accidentally. My mother still hasn't. A lot of people, when you look at the statistics of app purchases and web usage, they basically buy Android as their next feature phone. And all the stuff that we care about, every little geeky nuance of the phone, they don't care. It makes phone calls for them and it plays Angry Birds. And
my mom's Epic 4G is still running Froyo for whatever reason. She hasn't gotten the Gingerbread update. I don't know if it's a timing thing or... there's a serious problem with updates. And here's another big problem with updates. We saw the Samsung Galaxy Tab 10.1 get an update starting to push out yesterday. They had to pull it within hours because they were breaking things. There was something wrong.
So many cases of that. Going back through and looking at updates, I was surprised.
Yes.
I've got a Gmail app with your name on it, Phil.
Well, and there are some common denominators, too, there. I would willing to bet if you go back and look at a couple of the carriers who have had to pull who have had pull updates, one would probably stand out. Sprint.
I mean, but Droid X, Droid Incredible, I mean, both very problematic.
It happens a lot, and it can be kind of a problem to tell when it happens because sometimes it'll look like it's starting to come out, and then they pull
the Trio 700, that thing still haunts me. Palm.
I'm still waiting for my 750 to get Windows Mobile 6.5.
As I'm sure you get all the time, Phil, like one of the biggest complaints I got about my chart is that I had, just to try and be generous, I'd marked the Droid Incredible as updated to Gingerbread, and I got plenty of mail from people complaining that theirs wasn't. Well, it is tough to know.
The other thing that's interesting, just from a consumer perspective, is that Apple announces iOS 5, the day comes, and now they have over-the-air updates, so it'll be even faster, but everyone gets it. Yes, the servers go down. It's miserable 24 hours, but everyone gets it. And when they announced Gingerbread, it took a while for the Nexus 1, which they said was going to be a premier device, get updates, to get the update, and then it trickle updated, and I had to wait, I think, 3 weeks before it actually popped up on my phone.
T-Mobile says on their site, like they did an update for I forget which phone a couple weeks ago, and they said, "Do not call us until December 20th."
I think that creates sort of an expectational deficit between when people hear the word update, they know there's something new, and because they're a consumer, damn it, they want it, and the actual reality of delivering it to all the phones over time.
And it'll be interesting to see, well, one, how Apple deals with that as their numbers grow. Are they able to still do, and they do go to over the air. But it'll also be interesting to see with Ice Cream Sandwich that, with Froyo, with Eclair, other than the Nexus, it was 5-6 months until another phone shipped with it. 5-6 months until a pre-existing phone got an update. Same thing with Gingerbread, about the same time frame, 5-6 months. So it'll be interesting to see with ICS if we see, say, the Razr get updated sooner or later, if we see another non-Galaxy Nexus, assuming we see the Galaxy Nexus, come out with Ice Cream Sandwich sooner, or if it's going to be 6 months again, like it has been in the past.
Here's my question for you, Phil. I mean, at the end of the day, because of, it's Apache license, because it's an open handset alliance, what can Google do? Can they say if you agree to a Google certification process, you have to promise updates within 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, or the Gmail and Market apps will disappear from your phones? Because that kind of just punishes the consumer. What kind of stick could they wield on the manufacturers and carriers to make it a more harmonious environment?
I'm not sure, because at the end of the day, the carrier is going to say, okay, that's great. Give me some money. Because that costs money to do. It costs people to do it and time to do it. I just don't know. Something needs to happen. I absolutely agree something needs to happen. Just from a non-consumer, just platform perspective, something needs to happen.
But Google, I do think, you look at Microsoft's approach with Windows Phone, you look at some of the approaches on desktop, I think Google does have options. They may not be pretty options, but they could engineer their ecosystem and their OS in such a way that they would have, just like they've moved apps into the market, they could push more that way, where even the OS down sort of in a Linux style, down to a fairly core level, can be updated independently.
They could modularize it.
Exactly, right. And they do have
and we're starting to see that a little bit. We're not seeing it on nearly enough phones.
Right. And that hammer of that compatibility suite is a big hammer. I mean, that's one of the reasons, like Seth Clifford's piece talked about, you're not likely to see as much forking in the near term, because Amazon has their own app store. They have their own content. They have their own services.
Yeah. They're taking responsibility for...
Everybody else would have to build that.
Yeah. I mean, Playbook body aside, they're taking responsibility for the whole stack in that system.
Correct. And Google is doing most of that, and they have that. So they have the hammer to say, hey, we want you to shift to this way of doing things. And they seem unwilling or uninterested in doing that so far, which is interesting.
Could you see a day, Phil, where it is modularized like that, so that someone in Mountain View could pull a giant lever and the version of Android gets updated on your phone, even if the skin or even if certain carrier settings aren't?
No, because the carriers are still involved and they're going to be involved. I think if only from a regulatory standpoint, somebody has to sign off, right? Yeah.
They're going to run their tests.
And they would say, so what would they say? They'd say to Google, hey, we don't want Android phones anymore. Because if Google said, hey, the only way you're going to access,
we're going to go with WebOS.
I mean, what would they actually do if Google said, hey, Android 4.0 obviously not, but Android 5.0 works in this modular way, and we control the updates just like Market controls the update to Maps. We now do the browser that way. That would be a nice one. We do the core OS that way. What would they do? You'd say the carriers would say, no, we're not going to sell any Android 5.0 phones.
I think I think you can't bypass the carriers is what I'm saying. The carriers will have to have some sort of input here.
They'll want to test it against their network, right?
Yeah, it's their network, period.
But isn't it a grayscale, a grayscale between, obviously they don't test the new version of Google Maps on their network, right? I mean, if Google broke the browser
Google Maps
would
is not
that
a
be
framework.
reasonable? Where do you draw the line between...
You're not going to...
Well, they do pull it out and put Bing on some phones, though. I mean, like they do have certain... They've made their own contractual agreements. The other thing that sort of is interesting, and Mark Edwards from Bajango, who's our co-host on the Iterate show, brought this up, and he was talking more about the fragmentation that exists with screen sizes, where he did a chart, not dissimilar to yours, Michael, but he was concentrating mostly on screen sizes, and he was showing that with Apple, it's not bad because you have 1x or 2x, so everything falls on the grid, and for people not familiar with mobile design, a lot of designers want to be pixel perfect. They want to have every one of their pixels fall, like every pixel they design fall on a pixel on the phone. And Apple, you can pretty much do that. With Android, it's not so bad because you have 100% and 150%. So you have a 50-50 shot sometimes of getting a pixel perfect. The result of it not being perfect is it's a little bit blurry. My mom will never notice. I will. So it depends on the carrier. We get into Microsoft Windows 8, and they have these arbitrary percentages where it comes down only 20% of the pixels fall on the grid. And we spoke before about BlackBerry, where the one version of the torch has a different size screen than another version of the torch. I'll start with Phil. Is that, again, the price we pay for having hardware variety on some platforms? And if you don't like it, pick a platform that has no variety, that you're stuck with one model?
Yeah. And again, I'm not sure if it's right or not, but it's the way it is. I think it's interesting that the QHD resolution is already being supplanted by 720p. I think Google has done. I'm not sure I'm in a position to say it's done a good job. You'll need to ask a developer. But Google has absolutely made tools available for developers to scale up their apps. And as I've been playing with an iPad more and more, I mean, the way iPad apps scale up, the 1x, 2x button down in the corner is just ridiculous to me.
It's designed to be ugly, by the way. It's to force developers to make iPad versions.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you're right. But Google has absolutely put tools together to help developers and urge them, shall we say, to update their apps.
But it's still fundamentally a different thing, right? I mean, there's 10 different resolutions. There's dozen different screen sizes. Andy Rubin said that, hey, there shouldn't be different apps for tablets than for phones. They should just scale up. And those tools only get you close, right? I mean, you have phones that have the same resolution on a screen that's half the size of another phone, and all variations in between. And I think that's just part of the way you design an ecosystem is going to influence and indicate to people how they write apps. And the screen resolution being imperfect is just encourages people to not design apps pixel perfect, to not have everything thought out at that level. Same way, allowing background processes encourages people to just hit the internet all the time and requires Google in Ice Cream Sandwich to say, oh, we're going to give you tools to control background data, because it's just, if it can work that way, it's just easier to work that way. Don't worry about being pixel perfect. Don't worry about background data usage, because so tools to help you get there are not the same as being able to actually be
becomes back-end managed instead of front-end managed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would be careful saying that Google doesn't care about an app being as good as it possibly can be, because I guarantee you, if you ask any developer advocate, that any one of them will say they want developers to do as good a job, but they're not going to do it for them.
But the best job you can do on Android, if you're a designer trying to be pixel perfect, it's basically impossible, right? You can't be expected to design, and really the OS doesn't even entirely support saying, hey, we're going to support, hey, if you're a 3.2-inch screen with this resolution, here's all the exact layout for you. If you're a 3.4-inch screen, here's the exact, that's not really something you can do.
Right, and no, and as a developer, you're going to have
it's different than the best you can be on iPhone or iPad or Windows Phone.
Right, as a developer, you're going to have to target a certain API level and a certain, here are the screen resolutions you need to support. Absolutely.
What Seth does, Seth, our other co-host on Iterate, he works with Nickelfish, a development company, and they have certain reference chassis for Android. There's 5 or 6 devices. For example, like Motorola for a while had 57 pixels higher than the HTC phone. So they would say, these are the devices we're supporting. If
54, man, come on.
54, sorry, 54. We will make it work on these 5 devices. If you have other special requests, we'll do it, but we can't guarantee you compatibility across the range of devices. And for people listening, the resolution is not usually a big deal. If you have a 4-inch phone with the same screen size, the same screen resolution as a 5-inch phone, it'll look pretty much the same. It's still pixel perfect because the grid is the same. But when you start having arbitrary resolutions, even at the same screen size, if you have what is it, Phil? What are the standard Android screen size now? You have the 720p ones coming out, and right now you have the 960 by 540.
540, yeah. That's QHD.
Even if they're the same size, they're going to have problems. Yeah.
And now you have the addition of, are the buttons going to be on screen as they are in the Galaxy Nexus, or are they going to be the classic hard buttons? So that's another factor.
That actually became a bigger problem in Honeycomb.
Yeah.
Because they started taking the menu, the menu soft key, and they took that action and they put it up in the horribly named action bar. Except if you didn't, then you would end up with a little menu soft key in your app, and it was just horrendous and not well done. But again, that's up to the developers to fix. And everybody agrees that Honeycomb was just some. And I hate to say whipped out, because I'm sure a lot of people worked as hard as they could on it, but it was whipped out to get something out there to,
it was a placeholder
counter the iPad. Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting is that, because I don't want people to think that we're putting too much pressure on Google here, because on the flip side of this, we get people on the iPhone blog telling us they will never ever buy an iPhone because it doesn't have a bigger screen size, or it doesn't have a keyboard, or it doesn't have doesn't have LTE right now is another big one, and they live in an LTE market. So, just like some people are incredibly put off and upset by Google not updating phones or Google having, non-pixel perfect designs, other people are incredibly put off by Apple only having one model, regardless of how successful their update strategy is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a philosophy, and I think you take the good with the bad if you decide that's where you're going to go.
I completely agree. I think there's both are valid approaches, but I do think it's worth asking the question, with each one's chosen philosophy, how well are they executing against that philosophy? How well are they managing the downsides of their chosen philosophy? Google, hey, here's a rushed OS, here's a forgotten update lines. It seems like they could be doing a better job managing their chosen philosophy.
In all fairness, they announced 20 new products just today, so they're busy. They don't.
I would really be curious to know, like, the manpower that's available. The manpower that's available for a carrier working with Google. I mean, because it's a finite thing, right?
But some of these things are design choices, though. They're not just, right, the manpower, some of that manpower they opted to use to throw Honeycomb out there, to have something out there, right? There is some management decisions and some design decisions being made. It's not purely about manpower.
No, but at the end of the day, you got to have people to do it, too. So I think, manpower will dictate in the end what you can do.
And I think it's important, too, is that this is not a unique strategy to Google, like we were talking about before. Different screen sizes on the new BlackBerry lines. Most BlackBerries aren't being updated to the new OS at all, and 6.0 came out not just a very short time ago compared to the BlackBerry 7 devices. Palm has been, now I refuse to call them HP, by the way, Michael. Palm has been, if you talk to Derek Kessler from precentral.net, they have their own issues with who gets updates and when, and whether people getting the Pre 3 will ever get an update to those devices. So these aren't Google-specific devices. These are, like Michael said, if you choose that business model, these are the issues that you have to figure out how to manage.
And it's very interesting to see how Microsoft is sort of stepping gingerly in that regard, too, with their rollout of their phones and Mango,
and I've said this publicly before, any movement on Microsoft's part is a step in the right direction after that joke of an update button in Windows Mobile for a year.
in all fairness, people talk about how difficult it is to move a battleship. Think about how difficult it is to move a glacier. Those things do not corner very well.
No.
But ideally, you think about that when you're building the glacier, and you look
right.
down the road.
Not when you show up and you're standing at the foot of it saying, now what?
We have no engine.
Exactly.
There's no engine. We should have built a boat, not a glacier.
Yep.
Exactly.
All right. Phil, any wrap-up comments, anything in parting?
I like Michael. We got to do this again.
Oh, yeah, Michael's awesome.
Happy to do it anytime. And for the record, I'm not a hater. I have my Nexus S sitting here along with my iPhone.
Nice. I skipped the Nexus S. I had the Nexus 1. I'm going to go to the Galaxy Nexus. The Nexus S, I didn't partake.
Believe it or not, I mean, I've got one here, but I never really used it, and I was the same way.
Yeah, and I've said this before. The Nexus 1 was a forward-thinking Android device to me. It was like the thing of the future. The Nexus S was very similar to the Galaxy 2s, I thought. And I'm hoping that the Galaxy Nexus is going to be the next big leap forward. Because I'm not getting a new iPhone for God knows how long.
No, Michael, thank you for being here. I think it was a really good discussion.
Oh, happy to be here. Thank you for having me. It's very interesting.
All right, Michael, where can we find out more about you?
TheUnderstatement.com, or on Twitter, I'm DuGusta, DeGusta.
Nice. And are you going to keep that chart updated moving forward as fast as Google does?
I am. I've been working on a new version. I'm up through about March this year. I have about another 35 phones charted and ready to post soon.
Awesome. Phil Nickinson, I know everybody knows, but just for the record, where can we find out more about you?
Android Central, Phil Nickinson on Twitter, Phil Nickinson on Google+, when I'm not fragmented on different social networks.
Your social networks are fragmented. I find you on Facebook, on Twitter, on Google+. One of them gets updates, the other one doesn't. I have to keep looking at all three feeds.
Very well done, sir.
Not all social networks deserve to be updated.
No, that's right.
But
my Friendster is a legacy social network.
That's it. I'm done.
You can find me at Rene Ritchie. You can find all of us at Mobile Nations. You can find Phil's gang at Android Central, the iPhone blog at Tippy. You can email us at podcast@mobilenations.com or leave a comment when the show goes live. We'd love for you to go over to iTunes to subscribe and leave a rating to the show. It helps iTunes learn that they should be featuring us, which means more people can find us and more people can give us feedback, because these shows are all about the community. We have one of the best communities on the internet. We love you guys, and if you have any questions or comments, if Michael's got it wrong, if Phil's out to lunch, if I just don't know what I'm talking about, please email us in. We'll use your comments on a future show. Michael, Phil, thank you guys really much. That was an awesome debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.